Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about the American Civil War, one of the most defining and transformative periods in United States history. From April 12, 1861 to May 26, 1865, this conflict would reshape the nation, testing the very foundation of the American experiment in democracy and forever altering the social, political, and economic landscape of the country. Tonight, we will journey through those 4 tumultuous years, exploring the lives, battles, and moments that defined a generation and continue to echo through American society to this day. As we settle in for this exploration of the past, let us travel back to the America of the mid-19th century, a nation still young, still finding its identity, and deeply divided over questions that had haunted it since its founding. The story of the Civil War is not simply a tale of battles and generals, though these certainly play their part. It is a story of ideals and economics, of human bondage and freedom, of families torn apart, and a nation struggling to define what it truly meant to be united. To understand the Civil War, we must first understand the America that preceded it. In the decades before 1861, the United States was a nation of contrasts, divided both geographically and philosophically. The North had embraced industrialization, with factories rising in New England and the mid-Atlantic states, cities growing, and a diverse economy based on manufacturing, shipping, and commerce. Immigration from Europe swelled the population of northern cities, bringing workers to the factories and diversity to the urban landscapes. The South, meanwhile, had developed along a different path. Its economy remained largely agricultural, dominated by the plantation system that produced cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar. These cash crops generated enormous wealth for plantation owners, but this wealth was built upon the labor of enslaved African Americans. By 1860, nearly 4 million enslaved people lived in the South, representing the largest concentration of wealth in the entire nation. The cotton produced by enslaved laborers fueled not only the Southern economy, but also fed the textile mills of New England and England, making it what many called King Cotton. The institution of slavery had existed in North America since the early colonial period, but by the early 19th century, it had become increasingly concentrated in the South. Northern states had gradually abolished slavery following the American Revolution, inspired by the ideals of liberty and equality that had fueled independence. But in the South, slavery became more entrenched, defended not just as an economic necessity, but as a positive social good. A paternalistic system that, its defenders claimed, benefited both enslaved and enslaver. This fundamental difference in labor systems and social organization created increasingly divergent worldviews. The North moved toward a free labor ideology, celebrating the dignity of work and the opportunity for advancement. The South developed an aristocratic culture centered on the plantation, with a rigid social hierarchy and a profound investment in maintaining the status quo. The political compromises that had held the nation together began to fray. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had attempted to maintain a balance between free and slave states as the nation expanded westward. The Compromise of 1850 had tried to address tensions over territories acquired from Mexico, but each compromise seemed only to delay the inevitable confrontation, and with each passing year, the divide grew deeper. The 1850s brought a series of events that accelerated the nation toward crisis. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed territories to decide the slavery question through popular sovereignty, led to violent conflict in Kansas as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed to influence the outcome. Bleeding Kansas became a preview of the larger conflict to come, with neighbors fighting neighbors and violence spilling into the halls of Congress itself. The Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision in 1857 shocked the North by declaring that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, could not be citizens and that Congress had no power to exclude slavery from the territories. Chief Justice Roger Taney's opinion seemed to close off any possibility of containing slavery's expansion through legal means, energizing the young Republican Party that had formed in opposition to slavery's extension. In October 1859, an event occurred that sent shockwaves through both North and South. John Brown, a fervent abolitionist who had participated in the violence in Kansas, led a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Brown hoped to seize weapons and spark a slave rebellion across the South. The raid failed. Brown was captured by forces led by Robert E. Lee, then a colonel in the U.S. Army, and he was quickly tried and hanged. But Brown's actions and his dignified bearing at his trial made him a martyr in the North and a terrorist in the South. The South saw in John Brown the embodiment of their fears, proof that the North would not be satisfied until it had destroyed their way of life. Against this backdrop came the presidential election of 1860. The Democratic Party, which had bridged North and South, split along sectional lines. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas, while Southern Democrats put forward John C. Breckinridge. A third party, the Constitutional Union Party, nominated John Bell in a futile attempt to ignore the slavery issue altogether. The Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln, a former congressman from Illinois who had gained national attention through his debates with Douglas in 1858. Lincoln's position was moderate by Republican standards. He opposed slavery's expansion into the territories, but acknowledged he had no constitutional power to interfere with it where it already existed. Yet for the South, Lincoln's election was unacceptable. The Republican Party was purely sectional, with no support in the South, and its platform opposed slavery's expansion. Southern leaders saw in Lincoln's potential victory the first step toward their region's marginalization and eventual destruction. When Lincoln won the election in November 1860 with less than 40% of the popular vote, but a majority in the Electoral College, the South faced a moment of decision. Lincoln had won without carrying a single Southern state. To many Southerners, this proved they had lost control of the federal government, and that their rights and interests would no longer be protected within the Union. South Carolina, which had threatened secession during previous crises, acted first. On December 20th, 1860, a special convention unanimously voted to secede from the United States. The Declaration of Secession made clear that the preservation of slavery was the paramount concern, stating that the North's increasing hostility to slavery had made the Union untenable. Other Deep South states quickly followed. Mississippi seceded on January 9, 1861, Florida on January 10th, Alabama on January 11th, Georgia on January 19th, Louisiana on January 26th, and Texas on February 1st. These 7 states sent delegates to Montgomery, Alabama, where in February 1861 they formed the Confederate States of America, drafted a constitution, and elected Jefferson Davis as president and Alexander Stephens as vice president. The Confederate Constitution closely resembled the U.S. Constitution in most respects, but it explicitly protected slavery and strengthened states' rights. Vice President Stephens, in his famous Cornerstone speech, declared that the Confederacy was founded on the truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. President James Buchanan, serving his final months in office, declared secession illegal, but also claimed he had no power to prevent it. He left the crisis to his successor, Abraham Lincoln, traveling from Springfield, Illinois, to Washington for his inauguration, faced death threats and had to be secretly spirited through Baltimore in the middle of the night. In his inaugural address on March 4, 1861, Lincoln made a final appeal to the South. He reassured Southerners he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it existed, but he also made clear that he considered secession illegal and the Union perpetual. "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war," Lincoln declared. He closed with an eloquent plea. "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained it, must not break our bonds of affection." But the bonds had already broken. The question now was whether blood would be shed, and if so, where and when. The answer came at Fort Sumter, a federal installation in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Major Robert Anderson commanded a small garrison of U.S. troops who had moved to the fort from the more vulnerable Fort Moultrie in December. South Carolina demanded the fort's surrender, but Anderson refused. The Confederacy claimed ownership of federal property within its borders, while Lincoln was determined to hold, occupy, and possess federal installations. The situation at Fort Sumter became a test of wills. The garrison was running out of supplies, and Lincoln faced a dilemma. If he resupplied the fort, the Confederacy would likely attack it. If he abandoned it, he would be acknowledging Confederate independence. Lincoln chose a middle course, announcing he would send supplies but not reinforcements, putting the burden of starting a war on the Confederacy. Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his cabinet decided they could not allow the fort to be resupplied. On April 12, 1861, at 4:30 in the morning, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter. For 33 hours, cannons bombarded the fort from positions surrounding the harbor. Charleston residents gathered on rooftops and waterfronts to watch the spectacle, cheering as shells burst over the fort. Anderson's garrison returned fire, but was hopelessly outgunned. Remarkably, no one was killed during the bombardment itself. On April 13th, with the fort in flames and his supplies exhausted, Anderson agreed to surrender. As his garrison prepared to evacuate on April 14th, they fired a final salute to the U.S. flag. During this ceremony, an accidental explosion killed one soldier and mortally wounded another, the first casualties of the Civil War. The fall of Fort Sumter electrified the nation. The attack resolved the ambiguity that had paralyzed many in both North and South. Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. This call for troops forced the Upper South states to choose sides. Virginia, which had resisted secession despite its slave economy, voted to leave the Union on April 17th. Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina soon followed. 4 slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, remained in the Union, though the latter 2 were bitterly divided and would see significant Confederate military activity. The loss of Maryland would have been catastrophic for the Union, as it would have left Washington, D.C., surrounded by Confederate territory. Lincoln took controversial steps to ensure Maryland remained in the Union, including suspending habeas corpus and arresting pro-Confederate legislators. Across both North and South, the response to Fort Sumter was overwhelming enthusiasm for war. Volunteers rushed to enlist, far more than either government could initially arm and equip. In the North, massive rallies demonstrated support for the Union. A rally in New York City drew an estimated 250,000 people. In the South, similar enthusiasm prevailed, with volunteers flocking to join what they saw as a war of independence against Northern aggression. This initial enthusiasm reflected a profound misunderstanding on both sides of what was to come. Most people, North and South, expected a short war, perhaps a few battles that would resolve the crisis quickly. Some Union volunteers enlisted for only 90 days, confident the rebellion would be crushed before their service ended. Confederates believed the Northern society was too soft and divided to sustain a long war. Neither side could imagine the scale of death and destruction that awaited them. Both sides faced enormous challenges in transforming enthusiasm into effective military force. The regular U.S. Army numbered only about 16,000 men in 1861, scattered across the frontier in small garrisons. Many Southern officers resigned to join the Confederacy, including some of the Army's most talented leaders. Robert E. Lee offered command of Union forces, instead resigned to serve his native Virginia. The Confederacy would benefit greatly from this migration of military talent. The North had significant advantages in population, industry, and infrastructure. 23 states remained in the Union with a population of about 22 million, compared to 11 Confederate states with about 9 million people, including nearly 4 million enslaved African Americans who would not fight for the Confederacy. The North possessed about 90% of the nation's manufacturing capacity, far more railroad mileage, and control of the Navy. But the South had advantages of its own. It fought a defensive war on its own territory, with shorter supply lines and the benefit of interior lines of communication. Southern soldiers had a strong motivation, defending their homes and their way of life from what they saw as invasion. The South didn't need to conquer the North. It only needed to resist long enough for the North to tire of the war. The Confederacy also hoped for foreign intervention, particularly from Britain and France, who depended on Southern cotton for their textile industries. The first large armies to take the field were amateur affairs. Officers and men knew little of military tactics or discipline. Regiments were typically raised at the state level, with governors commissioning colonels who recruited their own troops. Many officers were elected by their men, or appointed based on political connections rather than military competence. The colorful and impractical uniforms reflected the romantic notions of war that still prevailed. Some regiments wore variations on French Zouave uniforms with baggy trousers and fezes, while others adopted gray, blue, or a mix of whatever cloth was available. Training was minimal and haphazard. Few officers had combat experience, and fewer still understood how to maneuver large formations. Soldiers drilled with their muskets and practiced basic movements, but nothing could prepare them for the shock of actual combat. The rifled musket, which had become standard armament, was far more accurate and deadly than the smooth-bore muskets of previous wars. But tactics had not yet adapted to this reality. Armies would still fight in dense formations, leading to catastrophic casualties. As spring turned to summer in 1861, pressure mounted on Lincoln to strike a decisive blow against the Confederacy. The Confederate capital had moved from Montgomery to Richmond, Virginia, just 100 miles south of Washington. Northern newspapers cried, "On to Richmond," and the public demanded action. General Irvin McDowell, commanding Union forces around Washington, protested that his army was not ready, but Lincoln insisted, "You are green, it is true, but they are green also." McDowell led about 35,000 men south toward the vital railroad junction at Manassas, where a Confederate force under General P.G.T. Beauregard waited. The march from Washington took several days, slowed by the inexperience of the troops and the chaos of moving a large army. Confederate spies in Washington easily learned of the advance, giving Beauregard time to prepare and call for reinforcements. On July 21, 1861, the armies clashed along a creek called Bull Run. What followed demonstrated the confusion and chaos that characterized early Civil War battles. McDowell's plan was sound, a flanking attack on the Confederate left, but execution was poor. Units got lost, attacks were poorly coordinated, and command and control broke down in the smoke and noise of battle. For most of the day, the battle seemed to favor the Union. Federal troops pushed back the Confederate left and seemed on the verge of victory. But Confederate reinforcements arrived by railroad from the Shenandoah Valley, including a brigade commanded by Thomas J. Jackson. As Confederate forces began to crumble, General Barnard B. rallied his men by pointing to Jackson. "There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." Jackson would be known as Stonewall for the rest of his life, which would end less than 2 years later. The arrival of fresh Confederate troops turned the tide. A Confederate counterattack broke the Union lines, and what began as an orderly withdrawal turned into a rout. Federal soldiers, many of whom had enlisted for only 90 days and whose terms were expiring, fled back toward Washington in panic. The retreat was complicated by the presence of civilians from Washington who had come to watch the battle as if it were a sporting event, bringing picnic baskets and champagne. The defeated army and fleeing civilians clogged the roads in a chaotic mass. The battle shocked the North. The easy victory they had expected had turned into humiliating defeat. But it also served a sobering purpose. Everyone now understood this would not be a short war. Lincoln called for longer enlistments and began preparing for a sustained conflict. In the South, Bull Run, which Confederates called First Manassas, brought dangerous overconfidence. If they could win so decisively against superior numbers, surely independence was within reach. While the Eastern Theater around Virginia and Washington drew the most attention, the Western Theater would prove equally important. The Confederacy stretched from Virginia to Texas, and the Mississippi River formed a crucial internal supply line. Union strategists understood that gaining control of the Mississippi would split the Confederacy and facilitate invasion of the South's heartland. The strategic situation in the West was complex. Kentucky, officially neutral at the war's start, was too important for either side to ignore. The state's rivers, the Mississippi, Ohio, Tennessee, and Cumberland, provided invasion routes into the Confederate heartland. When Confederate forces under General Leonidas Polk violated Kentucky's neutrality by occupying Columbus on the Mississippi in September 1861, it pushed the state government toward the Union, though Confederate sympathizers formed their own government, and Kentucky would be claimed by both sides. In early 1862, Union forces began a campaign to penetrate Confederate defenses in the West. The key to Confederate defenses were Forts Henry and Donelson in Tennessee, guarding the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. General Ulysses S. Grant, relatively unknown at the time, proposed a joint Army-Navy operation to capture these forts. Grant had graduated from West Point, but had resigned from the Army in 1854 under a cloud of rumored drinking problems. When the war began, he struggled to get a command, but Illinois eventually made him a brigadier general. He proved to be an aggressive commander, willing to take risks, a marked contrast to many cautious Union generals. In February 1862, Grant, working with Flag Officer Andrew Foote's gunboats, attacked Fort Henry on the Tennessee River. The fort fell quickly on February 6th, with the gunboats doing most of the work. Grant then marched overland to Fort Donelson on the Cumberland. The fighting there was harder. Confederate forces counterattacked, nearly breaking through Grant's encirclement, but Grant rallied his forces and tightened the noose. When the Confederate commander asked for terms, Grant replied with a message that would make him famous. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. The fort surrendered on February 16th, giving the North its first major victory and providing the North with a new hero, unconditional surrender, Grant. The fall of Forts Henry and Donelson forced the Confederates to abandon Kentucky and much of Tennessee, including Nashville, the first Confederate state capital to fall to Union forces. Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston withdrew south into Mississippi to reorganize and gather reinforcements. Jefferson Davis considered Johnston one of the Confederacy's finest generals, and Johnston was determined to strike back. That counterattack came in April 1862 at a small Tennessee settlement called Pittsburgh Landing, near a church called Shiloh. Grant had pushed south along the Tennessee River and encamped his army near the river, waiting for reinforcements under General Don Carlos Buell. Grant did not believe the Confederates would attack and did not fortify his position. It was a nearly fatal mistake. Before dawn on April 6, 1862, Johnston's Confederate army of 40,000 men struck Grant's camps. Many Union soldiers were still sleeping or cooking breakfast when Confederate battle lines emerged from the woods. Entire units were overrun before they could form proper battle lines. The surprise was nearly complete, and for hours it seemed the Union Army might be driven into the Tennessee River and destroyed. The fighting at Shiloh was unlike anything Americans had yet experienced. The two armies became intermingled in the woods and fields. Units became separated from their commands, and the battle dissolved into hundreds of individual fights. A peach orchard in bloom became a place of slaughter, its petals falling like snow on the dead and wounded. A sunken road where Union troops made a stand became known as the Hornet's Nest for the fury of Confederate attacks upon it. General Johnston was struck by a bullet that severed an artery in his leg. He bled to death within minutes, becoming the highest-ranking officer on either side to die in battle during the war. Command passed to P.G.T. Beauregard, who continued the attack into the afternoon. By evening, the Union Army had been pushed back to the river, but it had not broken. Grant, who had been away from the army when the attack began, returned and worked to stabilize his lines. When one of his subordinates suggested retreat, Grant replied firmly, "Retreat. Number 1, I propose to attack at daylight and whip them." That night, as the wounded cried out in the darkness, Buell's reinforcements began arriving by steamboat. The next morning, April 7th, Grant counterattacked with his reinforced army. Now, it was the Confederates who were outnumbered and exhausted. Beauregard, recognizing his army was fought out, ordered a withdrawal. The Confederates retreated to Corinth, Mississippi, and Grant did not pursue vigorously. The casualties at Shiloh shocked both nations. Combined losses exceeded 23,000 killed, wounded, and missing, more than all previous American wars combined. The scale of death was unprecedented. Americans began to understand that this war would be fought to exhaustion, that there would be no easy victories, no quick resolution. The war's character had fundamentally changed in the blood-soaked fields around Shiloh Church. Grant came under severe criticism for being surprised and nearly defeated. Calls for his removal reached Lincoln, who replied, "I can't spare this man. He fights." It was a crucial moment. Grant would remain in command and would prove to be the Union's most successful general. In the East, Lincoln had replaced McDowell after Bull Run with General George B. McClellan, who had won small victories in Western Virginia. McClellan was only 34 years old, a West Point graduate who had studied military systems in Europe and had demonstrated organizational genius in peacetime. He arrived in Washington to great fanfare and quickly set about creating a real army from the mob that had fled Bull Run. McClellan proved to be a brilliant organizer and trainer. He drilled his troops relentlessly, imposed discipline, and created an esprit de corps in what he christened the Army of the Potomac. Soldiers loved him, calling him Little Mac with genuine affection. He looked the part of a great general, sitting perfectly on his horse, reviewing endless parades of troops. But he had one fatal flaw. He was afraid to risk his army in battle. Throughout the fall and winter of 1861 to 1862, McClellan trained his army, but showed no inclination to use it. Lincoln grew increasingly frustrated, famously remarking that if McClellan did not want to use the army, he would like to borrow it. Finally, in March 1862, McClellan unveiled his plan. Instead of marching overland toward Richmond, which would mean fighting through northern Virginia, he would transport the army by sea to the peninsula between the York and James rivers and approach Richmond from the southeast. The Peninsula Campaign demonstrated both McClellan's organizational skills and his fatal hesitancy. The logistics of moving an army of over 100,000 men by sea were staggering, but McClellan accomplished it efficiently. By early April, Union forces were landing on the peninsula and beginning their advance. Richmond seemed within reach, but McClellan moved with excruciating slowness, consistently overestimating Confederate strength and calling for more reinforcements. When he encountered Confederate defenses at Yorktown, he insisted on a formal siege despite having overwhelming numbers. The Confederates used the time McClellan gave them to strengthen Richmond's defenses and gather forces. Robert E. Lee, who had been serving as military advisor to President Davis, took command of Confederate forces in Virginia on June 1, 1862, when General Joseph E. Johnston was wounded. Lee immediately demonstrated the aggressive spirit that McClellan lacked. In a series of battles known as the 7 Days from June 25th to July 1st, Lee attacked McClellan repeatedly. Though the battles were tactically inconclusive and costly to the Confederates, strategically, they were a Confederate victory. McClellan, convinced he was outnumbered, retreated to Harrison's Landing on the James River, giving up his advance on Richmond. The Peninsula Campaign had failed. Lincoln's frustration with McClellan deepened. The general who had spent months preparing and who possessed every advantage had been outfought by an outnumbered enemy. But McClellan remained immensely popular with his soldiers, and Lincoln could not easily remove him. While armies clashed on land, a naval war raged along the coasts and rivers. The Union's Anaconda Plan, proposed by General Winfield Scott, called for a naval blockade of the entire Confederacy to strangle its economy. At the war's start, this seemed impossible. The Union Navy was tiny, and the Confederate coastline stretched for 3,500 miles with numerous ports and inlets. But the Navy grew rapidly, and the blockade became increasingly effective, though it never became completely airtight. The Confederacy responded with innovation. Unable to match Union shipbuilding capacity, Confederate Secretary of the Navy, Stephen Mallory, invested in new technologies, particularly ironclad warships. When Union forces abandoned the Norfolk Navy Yard in Virginia at the war's start, they burned several ships, including the steam frigate USS Merrimac. Confederates raised the ship, cut it down to the waterline, and covered it with iron plates, renaming it CSS Virginia. On March 8, 1862, Virginia steamed into Hampton Roads and attacked the Union blockading squadron. Wooden warships were helpless against the ironclad. Virginia rammed and sank USS Cumberland, then destroyed USS Congress. Shells bounced harmlessly off Virginia's armor. It seemed the ironclad would destroy the entire squadron and break the blockade of southern Virginia. But the Union had its own ironclad. Designer John Erickson had built USS Monitor, a radical design featuring a rotating turret with two large guns mounted on a low, flat deck that sat almost at the waterline. Monitor arrived at Hampton Roads on the evening of March 8th, and the next morning met Virginia in the first battle between ironclad warships. The battle lasted for hours, the two ironclads battering each other at close range. Neither could seriously damage the other. Monitor was more maneuverable, but Virginia was larger and more heavily armed. The battle ended in tactical draw, with Virginia withdrawing and Monitor remaining on station. The immediate crisis had passed, but the implications were profound. Overnight, every wooden warship in the world had become obsolete. Naval warfare had been revolutionized. The Confederacy would build other ironclads, though never enough to break the blockade. Some Confederate naval efforts focused on commerce raiders, fast ships that hunted Union merchant vessels. CSS Alabama, built in Britain, became the most successful, capturing or destroying over 60 Union merchant ships before being sunk by USS Kearsarge off Cherbourg, France, in 1864. These raiders drove up insurance costs and drove many American merchants to register their ships under foreign flags, doing lasting damage to the American merchant marine. But the blockade held and tightened. By 1863, the Union Navy had grown to over 600 ships. Major Confederate ports fell to combined Army-Navy operations. In April 1862, Flag Officer David Farragut led a daring assault past the forts guarding the Mississippi River below New Orleans. With his wooden ships under heavy fire from Confederate batteries, Farragut forced his way upriver and captured New Orleans, the South's largest city and most important port. The loss was a devastating blow to the Confederacy. After the failure of the Peninsula Campaign, Lincoln consolidated Union forces in Virginia under General John Pope, who promptly suffered a crushing defeat at Second Bull Run in late August 1862. Lee, emboldened by this victory, decided to invade Maryland. A victory on Union soil might convince European powers to recognize Confederate independence, might encourage peace Democrats in the North, and might relieve pressure on Virginia's farms, which needed to harvest crops. Lee crossed the Potomac in early September with about 40,000 men, his army in high spirits, despite being poorly supplied and fed. Lincoln, having no better alternative, restored McClellan to command to meet this threat. What happened next was one of the war's greatest intelligence coups. On September 13th, Union soldiers found a copy of Lee's orders wrapped around 3 cigars at an abandoned Confederate campsite. The orders revealed that Lee had divided his army, sending Stonewall Jackson to capture Harper's Ferry, while the rest of the army moved into Maryland. McClellan, for once having perfect intelligence of enemy dispositions, moved to attack. But even with Lee's plans in his hands, McClellan moved too slowly to trap Lee's divided forces. Lee, learning his orders had been discovered, concentrated his army along Antietam Creek near the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. McClellan arrived with about 75,000 men, a substantial numerical advantage, but instead of attacking immediately, he spent September 16th planning and positioning his forces, giving Lee time to gather his scattered divisions. The Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17th, 1862, became the bloodiest single day in American history. McClellan's battle plan was sound. He would attack the Confederate left, center, and right in succession, preventing Lee from shifting forces to meet each threat. But the execution was piecemeal and uncoordinated, allowing Lee to shift troops to meet each crisis. The battle began at dawn when Union forces attacked through a cornfield on the Confederate left. For hours, control of the cornfield changed hands repeatedly in savage fighting. One Confederate officer wrote that the corn had been so shot through that it looked as if it had been cut by a knife, and the ground was covered with the dead. The cornfield fighting ended in stalemate after consuming much of the combat strength of both armies' left wings. The battle then shifted to the Confederate center, where a sunken road provided a strong defensive position. Wave after wave of Union attacks were thrown back until finally, Federal forces found a position to enfilade the Confederate line. The sunken road became known as Bloody Lane, after the terrible slaughter there left it filled with Confederate dead. In the afternoon, Union General Ambrose Burnside finally forced his way across a stone bridge over Antietam Creek on the Confederate right. His troops drove toward Sharpsburg, threatening to cut off Lee's line of retreat and destroy the Confederate army. At this critical moment, the last Confederate division under A.P. Hill arrived after a forced march from Harper's Ferry. Hill's men, many still wearing blue uniforms captured at Harper's Ferry, struck Burnside's flank and drove his forces back to the creek. As darkness fell, the battle ended. Combined casualties exceeded 22,000 killed, wounded, and captured, More Americans than would die in combat in the War of 1812, the Mexican War, and the Spanish-American War combined. The field was covered with bodies. One Union officer wrote that in places the dead lay so thick that he could walk across the field, stepping on bodies and never touching the ground. September 18th saw both armies catching their breath, burying their dead, and tending to thousands of wounded. Lee's army remained in position, daring McClellan to renew the attack. But McClellan, having suffered terrible losses and still believing he faced a larger army, did not attack. That night, Lee withdrew across the Potomac back into Virginia. His invasion had failed. Antietam was a tactical draw but a strategic Union victory. Lee had been stopped and forced to retreat. More importantly, it gave Lincoln the victory he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. From the war's beginning, the question of slavery had haunted Union policy. Lincoln had insisted the war was about preserving the Union, not ending slavery. Fearing that making abolition a war aim would alienate the loyal slave states and drive away Democratic support for the war. But pressure mounted from abolitionists, radical Republicans in Congress, and escaped slaves themselves, who began arriving at Union lines seeking freedom. Union generals struggled with what to do about fugitive slaves. Some returned them to their owners, but General Benjamin Butler at Fort Monroe in Virginia declared them contraband of war and refused to return them. Congress supported this approach, passing confiscation acts that freed slaves who had been used by Confederate forces for military purposes. African Americans, both free and enslaved, had no doubt that the war was about slavery. From the beginning, they sought to contribute to Union victory. Frederick Douglass, the famous abolitionist and former slave, pressed for the enlistment of black soldiers, arguing that once black men had fought for the Union, full citizenship would have to follow. Lincoln moved cautiously toward emancipation. He understood its military and diplomatic importance. Slavery provided labor that supported the Confederate war effort, and emancipation would prevent European recognition of the Confederacy. But he worried about border state loyalty and Northern racism. When Union generals like John C. Fremont in Missouri and David Hunter in South Carolina issued emancipation proclamations in their departments, Lincoln revoked them, insisting that such a momentous decision was his alone to make. By mid-1862, Lincoln had decided that emancipation was both morally right and militarily necessary. But he needed a Union victory to issue such a proclamation, lest it appear an act of desperation. Antietam provided that victory. On September 22, 1862, 5 days after the battle, Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that, as of January 1, 1863, all slaves in areas still in rebellion would be forever free. The proclamation was a conservative document in some ways. It didn't free slaves in loyal border states or in areas of the Confederacy under Union control. Lincoln justified it as a war measure under his powers as commander-in-chief, designed to weaken the Confederacy. But its implications were revolutionary. Lincoln had transformed the war's character. Now, the Union fought not just to preserve the nation, but to end slavery. The war had become a revolution. Reaction to the proclamation divided along predictable lines. Abolitionists celebrated, though some thought it didn't go far enough. Many Democrats attacked it, and it likely cost Republicans seats in the fall 1862 congressional elections. In the South, it was denounced as inciting slave insurrection and hardened Confederate determination. But in Europe, particularly in Britain, where working-class support for emancipation was strong, it helped ensure there would be no recognition of Confederate independence. Britain's working class, despite suffering from the cotton shortage caused by the blockade, could not support a slaveholding Confederacy fighting against a Union pledged to emancipation. Lincoln's frustration with McClellan finally reached its breaking point after Antietam. Despite having stopped Lee's invasion, McClellan failed to pursue aggressively, letting the Confederate army escape. When McClellan offered excuse after excuse for inaction, including complaints that his horses needed new shoes, Lincoln replied acidly, "Will you pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done since the Battle of Antietam that fatigues anything?" In November 1862, Lincoln replaced McClellan with General Ambrose Burnside. Burnside was aware of his own limitations He had twice declined command of the army before finally accepting. His humility proved well-founded. In December, Burnside ordered repeated frontal assaults against Confederate positions on high ground behind Fredericksburg, Virginia. Lee's army, strongly entrenched on Marye's Heights behind a stone wall, slaughtered wave after wave of Union attackers. "It is well that war is so terrible," Lee remarked as he watched the carnage, "or we should grow too fond of it." The Battle of Fredericksburg on December 13, 1862, was a one-sided disaster. Union casualties exceeded 12,000, while Confederate losses were less than 5,000. Burnside wanted to lead a personal assault the next day, but his subordinates talked him out of it. The Army of the Potomac withdrew across the Rappahannock River, demoralized and beaten. In January, Burnside attempted another advance that became known as the Mud March, when winter rains turned the roads into impassable mud. Lincoln removed Burnside and appointed General Joseph Hooker to command. As 1862 ended, the Union cause looked bleak in the East. The Army of the Potomac had suffered defeat after defeat. Morale was terrible, and desertions mounted. In the West, the situation looked better. Grant had captured Forts Henry and Donelson and survived Shiloh. Union forces controlled much of Tennessee and had captured New Orleans, but progress toward capturing Vicksburg and controlling the Mississippi had stalled. The war's end seemed no closer than it had a year earlier. End casualties had far exceeded anyone's predictions. General Joseph Hooker, who took command of the Army of the Potomac in January 1863, was confident almost to the point of arrogance. He reorganized the army, improved morale, and by spring had created a formidable fighting force of over 130,000 men. "My plans are perfect," Hooker boasted, "and when I start to carry them out, may God have mercy on General Lee, for I will have none." Hooker's plan for the spring 1863 campaign was indeed excellent. He would leave part of his army in front of Fredericksburg to pin Lee's forces in place, while the bulk of his army would march upstream, cross the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers, and come at Lee's flank and rear. Lee would be forced to retreat or be destroyed between two Union forces. The campaign began brilliantly. By late April, Hooker had gotten his army across the rivers and was approaching Lee's flank. Lee faced a desperate situation. Outnumbered more than 2-1, with enemy forces to his front and flank. Most generals would have retreated. Lee attacked. Leaving a small force at Fredericksburg, Lee marched west to meet Hooker's main body near a crossroads called Chancellorsville, an area of dense forest and thick undergrowth known as the Wilderness. When the armies collided on May 1st, Hooker inexplicably lost his nerve. Instead of pressing his attack, he pulled his forces back to a defensive position around Chancellorsville, surrendering the initiative to Lee. That night, Lee and Stonewall Jackson planned an even more audacious move. Lee would divide his already outnumbered army again, with Jackson taking 28,000 men on a long flank march to attack the Union right wing. Lee would remain with only 14,000 men to face Hooker's main force. It was a desperately risky plan that violated every rule of military science, but Lee understood that conventional tactics could not overcome Hooker's numerical advantage. On May 2nd, Jackson's corps completed its march and struck the Union 11th Corps, whose commander had ignored warnings of Confederate movements. The surprise was complete. The 11th Corps disintegrated, and Confederate forces rolled up the Union line. Only darkness and stiffening Union resistance finally stopped the assault. That night, Jackson rode out to reconnoiter Union positions. Returning to Confederate lines in the darkness, his party was mistaken for Union cavalry. Confederate soldiers fired, mortally wounding Jackson. He would die a week later from pneumonia following the amputation of his arm. His death was an incalculable loss to the Confederacy. He had been Lee's most trusted subordinate and most aggressive corps commander. Despite Jackson's wounding, Lee pressed the attack on May 3rd, driving Hooker's forces back. The battle reached its climax when Confederate artillery at Hazel Grove poured fire into Union positions around Chancellorsville. A cannonball struck a pillar of the Chancellor House against which Hooker was leaning, stunning him and possibly giving him a concussion. Though he remained nominally in command, he was not fully effective for the rest of the battle. Meanwhile, at Fredericksburg, Union forces under General John Sedgwick had finally broken through Confederate defenses and were marching toward Lee's rear. Lee, demonstrating the remarkable mobility of his army, sent forces to meet this new threat. On May 4th, Lee attacked Sedgwick at Salem Church, driving him back. By May 6th, Hooker had withdrawn his entire army back across the Rappahannock, the campaign a complete failure despite his overwhelming numerical advantage. Chancellorsville is often called Lee's masterpiece, a brilliant victory against long odds through audacious tactics and perfect cooperation between Lee and Jackson. But it came at a terrible cost. Confederate casualties were over 13,000, about 22% of Lee's army, and among the dead was Stonewall Jackson. Lee would never find another subordinate who understood his intentions so well or executed them so boldly. After learning of Jackson's death, Lee wrote, "I have lost my right arm." While attention focused on the dramatic battles in Virginia, Ulysses S. Grant was conducting one of the war's most brilliant campaigns in the West. Vicksburg, Mississippi, was the key to Confederate control of the Mississippi River. Perched on high bluffs overlooking the river, heavily fortified and defended by 30,000 men under General John C. Pemberton, Vicksburg seemed nearly impregnable. Grant spent the winter of 1862 to 1863 trying various approaches to Vicksburg, digging canals, attempting to bypass the fortress through bayous and swamps, all without success. Northern newspapers criticized him viciously, and rumors of his drinking resurfaced. But Grant persisted, and in April 1863 he began a campaign that would be studied in military academies for generations. Grant marched his army down the west bank of the Mississippi, had the Navy run gunboats and transports past Vicksburg's batteries under cover of darkness, and crossed the river south of the fortress. He was now in enemy territory with no supply line, and a numerically superior Confederate force between him and his base. It was precisely the situation military manuals said to avoid. Grant moved rapidly inland, living off the land and confusing Confederate commanders about his objectives. He defeated Confederate forces at Port Gibson and Raymond, then turned toward Jackson, the Mississippi state capital. On May 14th, he captured Jackson, driving out Confederate forces under Joseph E. Johnston and destroying the city's military resources. He then turned west toward Vicksburg, getting between Pemberton's army and Johnston's forces before the two could unite. On May 16th, Grant struck Pemberton's army at Champion Hill in one of the war's most decisive battles. Confederate forces fought desperately, nearly breaking the Union center, but Grant fed reinforcements into the battle and ultimately drove Pemberton back toward Vicksburg. The next day, Grant struck again at the Big Black River Bridge, routing Confederate forces and sending them fleeing back to Vicksburg's defenses. Grant assaulted Vicksburg's fortifications on May 19th and again on May 22nd, but the defenders repulsed both attacks with heavy Union casualties. Grant settled into a siege, surrounding the city and cutting it off from supplies. As spring turned to summer, conditions in Vicksburg deteriorated, food ran short, and civilians dug caves into the hillsides to shelter from constant Union bombardment. Soldiers and civilians alike began eating mules and rats. Pemberton held out hope that Johnston would gather forces and attack Grant's rear, lifting the siege. But Johnston's forces were too weak, and Grant maintained a strong defensive line facing outward. As June turned to July, Pemberton recognized the hopelessness of his situation. On July 4th, 1863, he surrendered Vicksburg and his army of nearly 30,000 men. The fall of Vicksburg, combined with the Union capture of Port Hudson, Louisiana, a few days later, gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River. The Confederacy was now split in two, with Texas, Arkansas, and most of Louisiana cut off from the rest of the South. Lincoln wrote, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." Even as Grant tightened his siege around Vicksburg, events were building toward the war's most famous battle. After Chancellorsville, Lee decided on another invasion of the North. His reasons were several. Virginia's farms needed relief from supporting his army. A victory on Northern soil might influence Northern public opinion toward peace, and Confederate armies everywhere needed success to maintain morale. The Army of Northern Virginia had achieved an aura of invincibility under Lee's leadership, and many believed it could accomplish anything. In June 1863, Lee's army of 75,000 men began moving north through the Shenandoah Valley into Maryland and Pennsylvania. The Army of the Potomac, now under General George Meade after Lincoln replaced Hooker, moved parallel to Lee, staying between the Confederate Army and Washington. Neither Lee nor Meade wanted to force a battle until they had concentrated their armies, but on June 30th, Confederate soldiers searching for shoes in the town of Gettysburg encountered Union cavalry under General John Buford. Buford, recognizing the strong defensive terrain around Gettysburg, decided to hold the town until infantry arrived. The next morning, July 1st, Confederate infantry attacked Buford's dismounted cavalry on ridges west and north of town. For several hours, Buford's troopers held out until Union infantry under General John Reynolds arrived. Reynolds was killed almost immediately, but his troops bought time for more Union forces to arrive. The battle grew throughout the day, as both armies rushed troops toward the sound of fighting. By afternoon, Confederate forces outnumbered Union forces, and aggressive attacks by divisions under A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell drove Union forces through Gettysburg to high ground south of town called Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. If the Confederates had pressed their attack late on July 1st, they might have captured Cemetery Hill before Union forces could organize a defense. But Ewell, who had replaced the aggressive Stonewall Jackson, hesitated, and by evening, strong Union forces held the heights. That night, both armies concentrated around Gettysburg. Lee's army formed a line roughly following Seminary Ridge, facing east toward the Union position. Meade's army held a strong defensive position shaped like a fishhook, with Cemetery Hill at the hook's eye, Cemetery Ridge running south, and two hills called Little Round Top and Round Top at the southern end. On July 2nd, Lee attacked both flanks of the Union line. In the south, Confederate forces under General James Longstreet assaulted Union positions in a peach orchard, a wheat field, and a rocky area called Devil's Den. The fighting was desperate and confused, with positions changing hands multiple times. The climax came at Little Round Top, where Union Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's 20th Maine Regiment held the extreme left of the Union line. Chamberlain's men repulsed attack after attack by Alabama. Regiments determined to capture Little Round Top and turn the Union flank. As ammunition ran low and Confederate forces prepared another assault, Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge down the hill. The desperate charge broke the Confederate attack and saved the Union left. Chamberlain would receive the Medal of Honor for his actions. On the Union right, Confederate forces attacked Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill as darkness fell. Some Confederate units briefly penetrated Union defenses, but were driven back after savage fighting. As July 2nd ended, both of Lee's flank attacks had failed, though at terrible cost to both sides. July 3rd saw Lee's final attempt to break the Union line. Against Longstreet's advice, Lee ordered an assault on the Union center on Cemetery Ridge. After a massive artillery bombardment that accomplished less than hoped, about 12,500 Confederate soldiers in divisions commanded by Generals George Pickett, James Pettigrew, and Isaac Trimble marched across 3/4 of a mile of open ground toward Union positions. What became known as Pickett's Charge was a magnificent and tragic spectacle. Confederate soldiers marched in perfect formation under withering artillery fire, dressed their lines under fire, and pressed forward into a storm of musket fire. A few hundred men, mostly from Brigadier General Lewis Armistead's brigade, actually reached Union lines at a stone wall in what became known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. Armistead, with his hat raised on his sword, led his men over the wall before being mortally wounded. But the breakthrough was brief. Union forces converged on the breakthrough and drove back the surviving Confederates. Of the 12,500 men who made the charge, more than half became casualties. The survivors fell back across the open field, and Lee met them saying, "It's all my fault." He expected Meade to counterattack, but the Union Army had also been badly battered, and Meade was content to have won a defensive victory. On July the 4th, as Vicksburg surrendered far to the west, Lee's army remained in position at Gettysburg, daring Meade to attack. But Meade did not attack, and that night, Lee began withdrawing toward Virginia. His invasion had failed, casualties were over 28,000, and the Army of Northern Virginia would never again possess the strength to mount a major offensive operation. Combined casualties at Gettysburg exceeded 50,000 killed, wounded, and missing. The battle became the war's most famous and would become central to American memory of the conflict. 4 months later, President Lincoln would travel to Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery for the Union dead. His Gettysburg Address, one of the greatest speeches in American history, redefined the war as a test of whether government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The twin Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg on July 4, 1863, marked a turning point in the war, though this was not immediately apparent to contemporaries. The Confederacy would fight on for nearly 2 more years with determination and skill, but it would never again threaten to win the war. The question now was not whether the Union would win, but how long it would take and at what cost. As 1863 progressed, the character of the war hardened. The initial romantic notions of war had long since died at places like Shiloh and Antietam. Now the war became what modern historians call hard war, directed not just at enemy armies, but at the economic resources and civilian morale that supported those armies. In the Mississippi Valley, following the capture of Vicksburg, Grant's forces spent the rest of the summer destroying Confederate resources. They burned warehouses, tore up railroads, freed slaves, and confiscated or destroyed food supplies. This was not mindless destruction for its own sake, but a calculated policy to destroy the Confederacy's ability to wage war. In Tennessee, Union and Confederate armies maneuvered for control of Chattanooga, a vital railroad junction. After the Battle of Chickamauga in September 1863, a rare Confederate victory in the Western Theater, Union forces were besieged in Chattanooga. Grant, newly appointed to command all Union forces in the West, came to relieve the siege. In late November, Union forces broke out of Chattanooga in spectacular fashion, with Union soldiers charging up Missionary Ridge in what was supposed to be a limited demonstration, but turned into a rout of Confederate forces. The victory opened the way for Union invasion of Georgia. African American soldiers increasingly played a role in Union armies. Following the Emancipation Proclamation, the War Department authorized the recruitment of black soldiers. By war's end, nearly 180,000 African Americans would serve in the Union Army, and another 20,000 in the Navy. These men, mostly former slaves or free blacks from the North, fought to prove their manhood and to secure freedom for their people. Black soldiers faced discrimination within the Union Army. They were paid less than white soldiers until 1864, often assigned to heavy labor rather than combat, and served under white officers until late in the war. But when given the chance to fight, they proved their worth. The assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina by the 54th Massachusetts Infantry in July 1863, though a tactical failure, demonstrated black soldiers' courage under fire and helped change Northern attitudes. Black soldiers who fell into Confederate hands faced special dangers. The Confederacy initially threatened to execute or enslave captured black soldiers and their white officers. At Fort Pillow in Tennessee in April 1864, Confederate forces under Nathan Bedford Forrest massacred black soldiers who were attempting to surrender, an atrocity that enraged the North and led to cries of, "Remember Fort Pillow." As 1864 began, Lincoln faced both military and political challenges. The presidential election would be held in November, and war weariness in the North was growing. Democrats, divided between those who supported the war effort and Copperheads who advocated peace even if it meant acknowledging Confederate independence, would likely nominate General George McClellan, who could run as a war hero while advocating a negotiated peace. Lincoln needed military victory to ensure his re-election and thus Union victory in the war. To achieve this, he turned to Grant, whom he promoted to lieutenant general, a rank previously held only by George Washington, and gave him command of all Union armies. Grant came east in March 1864, establishing his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac, though Meade remained in tactical command of that army. Grant's strategy for 1864 was simple in concept, but brutal in execution. All Union armies would advance simultaneously, preventing the Confederacy from shifting forces to meet each threat. The Army of the Potomac would fight Lee's army in Virginia, while General William T. Sherman, Grant's trusted subordinate, would drive from Chattanooga toward Atlanta. Secondary campaigns would target other Confederate armies and resources. Grant understood that the Confederacy's great advantage was fighting a defensive war on interior lines. To neutralize this advantage, Grant would attack everywhere at once and would maintain relentless pressure. Unlike previous Union commanders in the East, Grant would not retreat after battles. He would keep coming, using the North's superior numbers to wear down Confederate armies that could not replace their losses. The campaign began in early May 1864, when the Army of the Potomac crossed the Rapidan River and entered the Wilderness, the same dense forest where the Battle of Chancellorsville had been fought a year earlier. Lee, aware that the difficult terrain would negate Union numerical superiority, attacked on May 5th. The Battle of the Wilderness was a confused, chaotic affair, fought in dense undergrowth, where soldiers often couldn't see 50 feet. Musket fire started brush fires that burned wounded men alive. After 2 days of savage fighting, neither side had achieved a decisive result, and Union casualties approached 18,000. In previous campaigns, Union commanders had retreated after such battles. Grant didn't retreat. He moved southeast, trying to get between Lee and Richmond. Lee's army marched parallel and dug in near Spotsylvania Courthouse. What followed was 12 days of some of the war's most intense combat. Union forces assaulted Confederate trenches repeatedly, most notably at a salient called the Bloody Angle, where fighting on May 12th continued for 20 hours in pouring rain, much of it at hand-to-hand distance. Trees were cut down by musket fire. One officer wrote that the fighting was the most desperate and murderous struggle of the war. Grant again moved southeast, and again Lee's army raced to block him. At the North Anna River, Lee constructed elaborate entrenchments that created a trap for Union forces, but Lee fell ill at the critical moment, and the opportunity passed. The armies clashed again at Cold Harbor in early June, where Grant ordered a frontal assault on entrenched Confederate positions. The attack was a disaster, repulsed in less than an hour with over 7,000 Union casualties. Grant later wrote that he regretted ordering that assault more than any other decision of the war. The overland campaign from the Wilderness to Cold Harbor had cost Grant over 50,000 casualties in 6 weeks, more than the entire strength of Lee's army at the campaign's start. Northern newspapers called him the Butcher, and morale plummeted. But Grant had accomplished something important. He had forced Lee into a defensive posture, pinned his army in place, and inflicted casualties Lee couldn't replace. Unlike previous Union campaigns that had ended in retreat, Grant kept advancing. In mid-June, Grant made a bold move. He broke contact with Lee's army, marched south, crossed the James River on a massive pontoon bridge, and moved against Petersburg, a rail junction south of Richmond. If Grant could capture Petersburg, Richmond would have to be evacuated. But the initial Union assaults on Petersburg failed through a combination of poor coordination and stubborn Confederate defense, and Lee's army arrived to strengthen Petersburg's defenses. The two armies settled into siege warfare, digging elaborate systems of trenches that stretched for miles and foreshadowed the trench warfare of World War I. While Grant and Lee struggled in Virginia, Sherman advanced from Chattanooga toward Atlanta with 100,000 men. Opposing him was Joseph E. Johnston, with about 65,000 Confederates. Johnston, a defensive master, conducted a skillful retreat, always staying between Sherman and Atlanta, fighting from prepared positions, and inflicting casualties while avoiding decisive battle. Sherman, much like Grant, kept pressing forward. Throughout May and June, the armies fought a series of battles as Sherman flanked Johnston out of one position after another: Dalton, Resaca, Allatoona, New Hope Church, and Kennesaw Mountain. At Kennesaw Mountain on June 27th, Sherman uncharacteristically ordered a frontal assault on Confederate entrenchments and suffered a bloody repulse, losing 3,000 men while Confederate casualties were fewer than 1,000. But Sherman kept coming, and by mid-July, he had reached the outskirts of Atlanta. Jefferson Davis, frustrated with Johnston's constant retreating, replaced him with General John Bell Hood, an aggressive commander who had lost the use of an arm at Gettysburg and lost a leg at Chickamauga. Hood attacked Sherman's forces 3 times in 10 days, at Peachtree Creek, Atlanta, and Ezra Church, and was repulsed each time with heavy casualties. Sherman extended his lines to cut Atlanta's supply lines, and on September 1st, Hood evacuated the city. Sherman's army marched into Atlanta the next day, one of the most important Union victories of the war. "Atlanta is ours and fairly won," Sherman telegraphed Lincoln. The capture of Atlanta came at a crucial moment. Democrats had nominated McClellan in late August on a platform that called the war a failure and advocated immediate cessation of hostilities. Atlanta's fall undercut the Democratic argument and virtually ensured Lincoln's re-election. In the Shenandoah Valley, Lee had sent General Jubal Early with a corps to threaten Washington, hoping to draw Union forces away from Petersburg. In July 1864, Early's forces actually reached the outskirts of Washington. Lincoln himself came under Confederate fire while observing the fighting from Fort Stevens, making him the only sitting president to come under enemy fire. A young Union officer supposedly shouted, "Get down, you damn fool, before you get shot." The officer was Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., who would later serve on the Supreme Court. Early withdrew from Washington, but remained a threat in the Valley. Grant sent General Philip Sheridan with orders to follow Early to the death and to destroy the Valley's resources so thoroughly that crows flying over it for the balance of the season will have to carry their provender with them. Sheridan defeated Early's forces at Winchester and Fisher's Hill in September, then implemented Grant's orders with ruthless efficiency. His cavalry burned barns, mills, and crops, carried off livestock, and destroyed anything of military value. The burning of the Shenandoah Valley, one of Virginia's most important agricultural regions, was hard war at its most severe. On November 8, 1864, the presidential election took place. Despite the progress of Union arms, the outcome was not certain until late in the campaign. But Sherman's capture of Atlanta and Sheridan's victories in the Valley had changed public perception. Lincoln won decisively with 55% of the popular vote and 212 of 233 electoral votes. The soldier vote was overwhelmingly for Lincoln. Soldiers understood that a vote for McClellan was a vote to make their sacrifices meaningless. Lincoln's re-election ensured the war would continue until the Confederacy was defeated and slavery abolished. After capturing Atlanta, Sherman proposed a bold new campaign. He would march his army from Atlanta to the Atlantic coast, cutting loose from his supply lines and living off the land. Grant initially had doubts, but came to support the plan. In mid-November, Sherman began his march with 60,000 men, while he sent General George Thomas with another force back to Tennessee to deal with Hood's army. Sherman's march to the sea became one of history's most famous military campaigns. His army advanced on a broad front, destroying railroads, burning military resources, liberating slaves, and confiscating food and supplies. Sherman's orders were specific. Military resources were to be destroyed, but his army was not to molest civilians or private property unnecessarily. In practice, discipline varied, and bummers who ranged ahead of the army often exceeded their orders. The psychological impact of Sherman's march was as important as its physical destruction. Sherman's army passed through the heart of Georgia, essentially unopposed, demonstrating that the Confederacy could not protect its own territory. For slaves, Sherman's army brought freedom. Thousands of formerly enslaved people followed the army, seeing it as the long-prophesied day of Jubilee. On December 21st, Sherman reached Savannah on the coast. The Confederate garrison evacuated, and Sherman sent Lincoln a telegram. "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah." From Savannah, Sherman turned north into South Carolina, the state where secession had begun. His soldiers, many of whom blamed South Carolina for starting the war, showed even less restraint than they had in Georgia. Columbia, the state capital, burned. Whether from Confederate action, Union action, or accidental causes remains disputed, and much of the city was destroyed. Meanwhile, Hood had marched his army north into Tennessee in a desperate attempt to draw Sherman back. General Thomas assembled Union forces to meet him. At Franklin on November 30th, Hood ordered a massive frontal assault on entrenched Union positions. The Battle of Franklin was a slaughter. Confederate forces suffered over 6,000 casualties, including 6 generals killed and 6 wounded. One Union officer wrote that he saw Confederate dead piled up head high in front of Union positions. Hood's shattered army continued to Nashville, where Thomas attacked and destroyed it on December 15th and 16th. The Army of Tennessee, which had fought from Shiloh through Atlanta, essentially ceased to exist as a fighting force. The Western Theater was won, and Confederate forces there could no longer meaningfully threaten Union operations. As 1865 began, the Confederacy's situation was hopeless. Sherman was marching north through the Carolinas, Grant had Lee's army pinned at Petersburg, and Confederate forces were defeated or immobilized across the South. Yet the Confederacy fought on. Lee's soldiers, starving and in rags, continued to man the trenches around Petersburg through the winter. Desertion increased, but many remained loyal to Lee and their comrades. The Confederate government made desperate attempts to find new sources of manpower. In March 1865, the Confederate Congress, at Lee's urging, authorized the enlistment of slaves as soldiers, with freedom as a reward for service. It was an implicit admission that the Confederacy's whole foundation was built on a lie. If African Americans could fight as soldiers, the entire justification for slavery crumbled. But the war ended before significant numbers of black Confederate soldiers could be recruited. On January 31, 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, abolishing slavery throughout the United States. Lincoln had worked behind the scenes to ensure the amendment's passage, and he considered it the completion of the work begun by the Emancipation Proclamation. The amendment would be ratified by the states in December 1865, ensuring that slavery would not return even in states that had remained loyal to the Union. In March 1865, Lincoln was inaugurated for his second term. His second inaugural address, considered by many to be the greatest inaugural address in American history, reflected on the war's meaning and looked forward to peace. "With malice toward none, with charity for all," Lincoln said, "with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds." It was a call for reconciliation, though Lincoln knew that the work of Reconstruction would be difficult and controversial. On April 1, 1865, Grant launched a series of attacks on Confederate positions around Petersburg. At Five Forks, General Philip Sheridan's cavalry and infantry smashed through Confederate defenses, turning Lee's right flank. The next day, Grant ordered a general assault all along the Petersburg lines. Confederate defenses, stretched thin by casualties and desertion, finally broke. Lee informed Jefferson Davis that Petersburg and Richmond must be evacuated. On the night of April 2nd to 3rd, the Confederate government fled Richmond. Soldiers set fire to warehouses and military supplies to prevent their capture. The fires spread, and much of Richmond burned. Union forces occupied the city on April 3rd, and Lincoln, who had been visiting Grant at his headquarters, entered Richmond on April 4th. He walked the streets of the former Confederate capital, visiting the house where Jefferson Davis had lived, sitting in Davis's chair. Freed slaves gathered around Lincoln, some kneeling before him. "Don't kneel to me," Lincoln told them. "You must kneel to God only, and thank Him for the liberty you will enjoy hereafter." Lee's army, about 30,000 exhausted and starving men, retreated west from Petersburg, hoping to reach Danville where supplies waited, and then turn south to join Johnston's army in North Carolina. Grant pursued relentlessly. Union forces blocked Lee's path at every turn, and Lee's army bled men through capture and desertion. On April 6th, at Sailor's Creek, Union forces destroyed about a quarter of Lee's remaining army. By April 8th, Lee's army had reached Appomattox Courthouse, a small village in central Virginia. Union cavalry blocked the road ahead, and infantry was approaching from behind. Lee's situation was hopeless. He could order his men to scatter into the countryside and conduct guerrilla warfare, but he knew this would mean years of continued bloodshed and devastation. On the morning of April 9th, Lee sent a message to Grant asking to discuss surrender terms. That afternoon, Lee and Grant met in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house in Appomattox Courthouse. The contrast between the two commanders was striking. Lee, tall and dignified, wore his best uniform with a jeweled sword. Grant, shorter and rough-hewn, wore a private's blouse with his general's stars sewn on, his uniform muddy from hard riding. But Grant's terms were generous. Confederate officers and men would be paroled and allowed to go home. Officers could keep their sidearms, and any soldier who owned a horse could keep it. They would need them for spring plowing. Confederate soldiers would not be prosecuted for treason. Grant also ordered that rations be provided for Lee's starving men. Lee accepted the terms and signed the surrender document. As he left the McLean house, Union soldiers began celebrating, but Grant ordered them to stop. "The war is over," he said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." The Army of Northern Virginia, which had fought so long and so well, stacked its arms and furled its flags for the last time on April 12, 1865. Other Confederate armies surrendered in the following weeks. Johnston surrendered to Sherman in North Carolina on April 26th. Confederate forces in Alabama and Mississippi surrendered on May 4th. The last Confederate army east of the Mississippi, under General Edmund Kirby Smith, surrendered on May 26, 1865, the war's official end date. The joy of victory in the North was short-lived. On the evening of April 14, 1865, 5 days after Lee's surrender, President Lincoln attended a performance at Ford's Theater in Washington. He had been receiving death threats throughout the war, but refused to let them constrain his movements. That night, John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and Confederate sympathizer, entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. Lincoln died the next morning without regaining consciousness. Booth was part of a conspiracy to kill Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William Seward. Only Booth succeeded in his objective. Seward was seriously wounded, but survived. Booth escaped from Washington, but was tracked down and killed by Union soldiers on April 26th. His co-conspirators were captured, tried by military commission, and 4 of them, including the first woman executed by the federal government, were hanged. Lincoln's assassination shocked the nation and the world. Just when the terrible war had ended and the work of rebuilding could begin, the leader who might have guided that process with wisdom and compassion was gone. The outpouring of grief was unprecedented. Lincoln's body was carried by train from Washington back to Springfield, Illinois, retracing in reverse the route he had taken to his first inauguration. At stops along the way, thousands came to pay their respects. Lincoln, the president many had criticized during the war, became in death a martyred savior of the Union. The American Civil War was the deadliest conflict in American history. Approximately 750,000 soldiers died, about 360,000 Union and 390,000 Confederate, from combat, disease, and other causes. This represents more American deaths than in all other American wars combined, from the Revolution through Korea. Thousands more were wounded, many suffering disabilities for the rest of their lives. The war touched virtually every American family, North and South. The financial cost was staggering. The Union spent over $6 billion prosecuting the war, the Confederacy perhaps $2 billion. Much of the South's infrastructure was destroyed, railroads torn up, cities burned, farms devastated. The Confederate dollar became worthless, wiping out the savings of those who had invested in Confederate bonds. The South's economy would take generations to recover. But the war's most important legacy was not measured in dollars or casualties, but in fundamental transformations of American society. Slavery, the institution that had existed in North America for nearly 250 years, was destroyed. 4 million people who had been property became free. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution abolished slavery, guaranteed citizenship and equal protection of law, and protected voting rights regardless of race. The United States emerged from the war transformed. Before the war, the country was referred to in the plural. The United States are. After the war, it became singular. The United States is. The federal government's power had been vastly expanded. Questions about the relationship between federal and state authority, about whether states could secede, had been definitively answered. The United States was an indivisible nation. The war also transformed the North's economy and society. The demands of war had accelerated industrialization, strengthened banking systems, and led to construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Homestead Act, passed during the war, opened Western lands to settlement. The Morrill Act created land-grant universities that would educate future generations. For African Americans, the war meant freedom, but also a long and often violent struggle for full equality. Reconstruction brought real gains. Black men gained the right to vote. Black communities built schools and churches. Black politicians were elected to state and federal office. But Reconstruction was opposed by white Southerners who used violence and legal restrictions to reassert white supremacy. When Reconstruction ended in 1877, much of what had been gained was lost. It would take another century and another great struggle, the Civil Rights Movement, to achieve the full promise of emancipation. The Civil War profoundly shaped American culture and memory. Veterans on both sides formed organizations to preserve their memories and care for disabled comrades. Battlefield sites became sacred ground, places of pilgrimage where the living could honor the dead. The war produced an enormous literature, memoirs, histories, novels, poems, as Americans tried to make sense of their experience. Reconciliation between North and South occurred gradually, often at the expense of historical accuracy. As the generation that had fought the war aged and died, their sons and grandsons created a mythology of the lost cause, portraying the Confederacy as fighting for states' rights rather than slavery, and Confederate soldiers as noble warriors who had fought valiantly against overwhelming odds. This mythology, while comforting to white Southerners, obscured the central truth that the war had been fought over slavery and that the Union cause had been just. As we reach the end of this long journey through the American Civil War, it's worth reflecting on what this conflict meant and continues to mean. The war was America's most traumatic experience, a crisis that tested whether the democratic experiment could survive, whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could endure. The soldiers who fought this war were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. They were farmers and shopkeepers, students and laborers, native-born and immigrants. Most had no military training when they enlisted. They endured conditions that we can barely imagine, marching for miles in heat and cold, living on meager rations, sleeping on the ground, watching friends die of disease and combat wounds. They fought in battles that tested human endurance to its limits. Why did they do it? Motivations varied. Union soldiers fought to preserve the Union, to defend democratic government against rebellion, and increasingly to end slavery. Confederate soldiers fought for their states, their homes, their way of life, and to defend what they saw as their constitutional rights. Many on both sides fought simply because their communities expected it, because their friends were fighting, because they believed in their cause. As the war dragged on and casualties mounted, many continued fighting because of loyalty to their comrades, and because they could not bear to think that their friends had died for nothing. The generals who commanded these armies were a mixed lot. Some, like Lee and Grant, demonstrated genuine military genius. Others were mediocrities elevated beyond their abilities. Many learned their trade through bitter experience, making mistakes that cost thousands of lives. The relationship between political leaders and military commanders was often fraught, with civilian authorities trying to understand military possibilities while generals complained about political interference. The war changed how wars were fought. The combination of rifled weapons, railroads, and telegraph created a scale of warfare previously unknown. Armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Battles produced casualties in the tens of thousands. Trenches and field fortifications presaged World War I. The concept of total war, of targeting not just armies but the economic resources that supported them, would influence military thinking for generations. For those who lived through it, the Civil War was the defining experience of their lives. Years afterward, veterans still dreamed of battles, still woke in the night hearing the cries of the wounded. They had seen things and done things that changed them forever. They had learned that war was not the glorious adventure imagined by civilians, but something terrible and transformative. The war left deep scars on the American psyche that have never fully healed. Arguments about its causes, conduct, and meaning continue to this day, but certain truths seem clear. The Union cause was just. Slavery was a great evil that had to be destroyed, and the sacrifice of those who fought to preserve the Union and end slavery was not in vain. As we conclude this account of the American Civil War, let us remember that the men and women who lived through those terrible years were not so different from us. They loved their families, hoped for the future, and tried to do what they believed was right. They faced choices we can barely imagine and made sacrifices that shaped the nation we inherited. Their story of courage and fear, of nobility and cruelty, of idealism and pragmatism, remains profoundly relevant to understanding both American history and human nature. The American Civil War was a trial by fire that forged a new nation from the wreckage of the old. It was America's most terrible and most transformative experience, a war that ended slavery and preserved the Union, but at a cost that still echoes through American society. Understanding this war, in all its complexity and tragedy, remains essential to understanding America itself. And so, as night deepens and this long story comes to its close, we leave the battlefields and the generals, the soldiers and the civilians, the enslaved who became free and the nation that was reborn. The American Civil War was many things: a military conflict, a social revolution, a constitutional crisis, a human tragedy. Above all, it was a test of whether the American experiment in self-government could survive its greatest challenge. That it did survive, that the Union was preserved and slavery abolished, represents one of the most important achievements in human history. The cost was terrible, the suffering immense, but the result, a nation dedicated to the proposition that all people are created equal, justified the sacrifice of those who gave, in Lincoln's words, the last full measure of devotion. Sleep well, and may the lessons of this great conflict continue to inform and inspire us in our own time, as we work to build a more perfect union, and to ensure that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth.